15 years. That's all he had left.
I'm sure they just meant it as a joke. It doesn't mean anything.
A life spent working, paying, surviving. For what? He thought it was just a joke. But then, he saw him. And a choice no man should ever face. To die forgotten, or to live forever as something else.
I expected you sooner.
A face older than death itself. Chapter 1. 15 years. Edward Hale turned 59 on a Wednesday. No celebration, no fuss. His wife had gone to work early, leaving him with the silence of the house and a lukewarm cup of tea on the counter. At 9:10, the postman clattered the letterbox. A single envelope slid across the worn doormat, cream-coloured with a bold, jovial scrawl. It was from Graham, an old friend from his 20s he hadn't spoken to in years. Edward smiled faintly until he opened it. On the front of the card was a cartoon man with a pint in one hand and a walking stick in the other. A banner above him read, "The average male lifespan, 75 years. Congratulations, Ed. Only 15 to go." Inside in big red letters, "Make them count." Edward stared at it for a long time. The smile died from his lips.
15 years, that's it.
The number burrowed into his chest like a cold nail. He carried the card into the kitchen, sat down, and pushed his tea aside. 15 years, he whispered. That's it. The weight of years. Edward's life was not a failure, but neither was it a triumph. It was a steady, obedient march. He had worked since 16, 30 years in the same company, grinding out his days behind a desk, paid the bills, paid the mortgage, raised 2 children who had long since left for their own lives. The house wasn't even his, not really. 20 years into a mortgage and still a balance that mocked him each month. No savings, no pension to speak of, just work, bills, and more work. He had never invented, never built, never created. He had merely kept the machine oiled so others could profit. And now, at 59, he saw the truth. His reward for decades of loyalty was 15 years of dwindling health before the grave. He pressed his thumb against the card until it bent. Graham had meant it as a joke, but Edward felt no humour in it. It was a reminder that the clock was no longer ticking toward possibility. It was ticking toward nothingness. The walk. Later that morning, restless, he went for a walk. It was early spring, the air sharp but not cold. On the green by the estate, a group of teenagers were kicking a football. Their laughter rang out across the road, carefree and certain of its right to exist. Edward paused, watching them. He thought of the card. 70 years. 60. Maybe more for them. Time stretched out before them like an endless horizon. For him, there was no horizon. Only a narrowing tunnel that ended in black. A bitterness rose in him, not at the children, but at himself. For spending decades as if time was infinite, when it had never been. In that moment, something stirred, a thought he hadn't dared articulate before. Man is not meant to live for others alone. Not for his boss, not for his children, not for his mortgage. Man is meant to live for himself, and I never did. He had bartered away his hours for wages, his dreams for obligations, his fire for the illusion of safety. He had never asked, "What do I want?" The words of an old book he had once skimmed came back to him, half forgotten, but now burning. A man's life is the standard of value, and yours is the only one you have. The realization hit him harder than Graham's cruel joke. It wasn't just that he had 15 years left, it was that he had wasted the 59 before it. Chapter 2. The Joke That Wasn't. That evening, Edward sat in his chair by the fire, the card from Graham resting on the table between them. His wife, Margaret, was knitting, half watching the television. He picked the card up again, turned it in his hands. "Do you know what this says?" he asked. She glanced over. "I saw it earlier. It's just Graham's humour, Ed. Don't let it bother you."
I'm sure they just meant it as a joke. It doesn't mean anything.
"It's no joke," Edward said. His voice was sharper than he intended. "It says, I've got 15 years left. 15 if I'm lucky. That's not something you laugh about." Margaret sighed. "Everyone gets old. That's life. We haven't even paid the mortgage off. In 7 years it'll be cleared," she said, the way one repeats a household fact. Edward stared at her. 7 years. Nearly half the time he had left, just to own a house he'd barely get to live in before the earth claimed him. "What's the point?" he said quietly. 7 years of struggle, for 7 years of walls and bricks. Is that what all this has been for? Margaret looked at him over her glasses, but didn't answer. She went back to her knitting, and the television filled the silence. The morning after. Edward woke the next day with the words still echoing in him. 7 years for 7 years. It wasn't despair that met him in the mirror, but something else. Clarity. The routines of his life seemed thinner, as though the veil had been pulled back.
I thought I might just take a chance.
On impulse, he phoned a man he hadn't seen in decades. An old friend. Daniel Mercer had always been different. At university he'd painted, sculpted, written. While the others chose careers with pensions and promotions, Daniel chose creation. Against advice, against the odds. Now in his 60s, he still painted. His work wasn't world famous, but it hung in galleries, in private collections. He lived comfortably, if not richly. But more than that, he lived. They met in a cafe by the river. Daniel looked older, his hair long and silver, but his eyes burned with the same restless light Edward remembered. "Ed Hale," Daniel said warmly. "I almost didn't believe it when you rang." "How are you?" Edward shrugged. 59. That about sums it up." Daniel smiled. "Ah, that dangerous age, where you start counting backwards instead of forwards." Edward pulled out the card and set it on the table. 15 years, it says. And it's right, isn't it? That's all I've got left. I've worked my whole life and I've nothing to show for it. No savings, no pension, still paying a mortgage. And I never did what I wanted to do. Daniel studied him. "And what did you want to do?" Edward opened his mouth, then closed it. "I don't even know anymore. All I see now is the countdown." Daniel leaned forward, his voice low but alive. "Listen to me, Ed. There is no age to creation. There is no expiry date on becoming who you are. The world fools you into thinking safety is life. Mortgages, jobs, retirement funds. But that's not life. That's survival. Life is this." He tapped his chest. "This hunger to shape, to build, to make something that did not exist before you. I've done it for decades. Not because it made me rich, it didn't. But because every day I woke knowing the canvas was mine, the work was mine. That's the only real wealth. To look at your years and know they were spent on your own terms. That is success, even if the world never claps for you." Edward listened, his throat tightening. Daniel went on. "The tragedy isn't that you have 15 years left, Ed. The tragedy would be to spend those 15 in the same sleep as the 59 before them. Wake up. Choose. There is no system holding you, except the one you accepted." It sounded to Edward like half philosophy, half revelation, and for the first time in years, he felt something spark inside him. But when Daniel paused, Edward only said, "What if there's nothing left in me to create?" Daniel smiled, a sad, knowing smile. Then you've only forgotten what it is. Find it, because I promise you, there's no age to begin. That night, Edward lay awake, Margaret's steady breathing beside him, Daniel's words replaying over and over. There is no age to creation. But what was he to create? He had no art, no music, no invention hidden in him. He had only ever been ordinary. Then, like a light flickering in the dark, a thought came. Not creation, perhaps, but something close. Something that had always drawn him in quiet ways. Antiques. As a boy, he had lingered over his grandfather's pocket watch, fascinated by its weight and history. He had spent hours wandering antique shops, fingers brushing along carved wood and tarnished brass. There was a mystery in old things, a dignity. Maybe that's it, he whispered to himself. Maybe I can't create, but I can preserve. The idea warmed him. A small step, but a step nonetheless. The auction. The following evening, he found himself in a small auction house on the edge of town. The place smelled of polish and dust, with about a dozen people scattered across wooden chairs. Edward sat near the back, clutching the folded catalogue. He had barely enough money for groceries, let alone treasures, but he felt alive being there. A silver tea set went by, then a grandfather clock, then a stack of faded maps. The numbers rose too quickly for him to follow. Then they brought out a cane, a slender walking stick of dark wood, its head carved with strange symbols, almost runes, almost letters, neither one nor the other. Edward's breath caught. Something about it called to him. "Lot 32, ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer said. "Opening at £20. Silence. No one raised a hand. Edward hesitated, then lifted his. 20. The word left his lips with a thrill.
Do I hear 30?
Instantly, from the far side of the room, another hand rose. A man, swathed in a wide-brimmed hat, dark glasses, scarf pulled high over his face. His skin was hidden entirely beneath cloak and gloves. 30, the auctioneer called. Edward frowned. He raised his hand again. 40. 50, came the reply. The stranger's voice was low, strange and muffled. Edward's chest tightened. He had no business bidding. His bank account was bare, but he wanted it. Wanted it more than he'd wanted anything in years. 100, the stranger said suddenly. The room shifted, murmured. Edward lowered his hand. He couldn't go higher. He stared at the cane, then at the man who had stolen it with ease. The hidden figure sat motionless, impassive, as if carved from stone. Shame burned Edward's cheeks. Another failure. He stood abruptly, muttered an apology, and left before the gavel fell. At home, Margaret was
Edward.
already in her nightgown when he came in.
What happened this time?
"Where have you been?" "An auction," he said, pulling off his coat. "An auction? Edward, we can't afford that. We've got bills, the mortgage." He turned on her, more sharply than he intended. Bills, mortgage. Always the same words. Who's going to remember I paid the bloody mortgage in 100 years? Who's going to remember me at all? I could vanish tomorrow, and it would be like I never existed. Margaret's face softened, but her voice stayed firm. "It's irresponsible, Ed. That's just life." "No," he muttered, pacing. "That's just surviving, and I'm sick of it." The parcel. The night passed heavy with silence. The next morning, as Edward was making tea, the doorbell rang. He opened it to find the postman standing there, holding a long parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Delivery for Mr. Hale." Edward frowned. He hadn't ordered anything. He signed, carried it inside, and laid it on the table. His hands trembled slightly as he tore away the paper. Inside was the cane, the same dark wood, the same carved runes. No note, no explanation. Edward's breath caught in his throat. The weight of it in his hands was cold, unnatural, as though the wood had remembered far more years than it should. He turned it slowly, his reflection catching faintly in the polished head. For a long moment, he simply stared, a strange mix of fear and exhilaration rising in him. The auction was lost, and yet here it was. The cane had found him. Chapter 4. The visitor. Edward spent the afternoon with the cane. He ran his hands over the polished wood, tracing the strange runes as though they might whisper their meaning if he lingered long enough. He stood before the mirror, holding it with a dignified air, tilting his chin as though he were some gentleman of a forgotten age. He chuckled, embarrassed by his own play-acting, but there was no denying the rush he felt. The cane made him feel different, confident, important. For the first time in years, Edward felt like he owned something that mattered. As the sun fell and the house darkened, he set the cane by his chair and settled in for the evening. Margaret was upstairs, preparing for bed. The silence of the house was deep. Then came the knock. A slow, deliberate rap, rap, rap against the front door. Edward frowned, stood, and crossed the hallway. He opened the door. Standing there was the man from the auction. The wide-brimmed hat, the long cloak, the scarf pulled up over his mouth, the gloves that showed no flesh. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice low and smooth, "but I believe the auction house may have sent my cane here by accident." Edward's heart sank. His hands tightened on the doorframe. Of course, it had been too good to be true. Just a clerical error, a mistake in the delivery. Unless it wasn't. Yes, they must have. I didn't win it. It's yours. Let me get it for you. He stepped back. Come in. The man entered without a sound, moving like a shadow given shape. He waited in the hallway, still and silent, as Edward fetched the cane. Margaret descended the stairs just then, hair tied back, slippers on her feet. She glanced at the visitor and froze. A cold shiver crawled up her spine. Something about him was wrong. Not just the clothes, not just the concealment, something deeper. She felt it in her bones. The man inclined his head slightly as she passed, and though no expression showed, Margaret could not shake the sense that she had brushed against death itself. She hurried into the kitchen, not daring to look back. Edward returned, cane in hand. He held it out reluctantly. The stranger accepted it with long, gloved fingers. Then, for the first time, the man removed his dark glasses. Edward's breath caught. The eyes that met his were not the eyes of any ordinary man. They were ancient, fathomless, burning with a weight of knowledge and power that stretched beyond centuries. Edward felt suddenly very small. The man slipped the glasses back on and reached into his cloak. He drew out a small, cream-coloured card and handed it to Edward. "I appreciate your honesty," he said softly. "Come visit me one day, but make sure it is in the evening. I don't do daytimes." With that, he tipped his hat, turned, and vanished into the night. Edward stood in the hallway, the card trembling in his hand. The echo of those eyes still seared into his mind. Chapter 5. The Dream. Margaret asked as he locked the door. "Who was that man, Edward?" He forced a casual tone. "Oh, nothing. The auction house sent me that cane by mistake. He was the one who won it. Just came to collect it." She frowned. "Something about him. I don't know what it is. But stay away from him, Edward. Promise me." He nodded, but without conviction. They climbed the stairs together, the house settling into silence. The dream. Edward drifted into sleep and into the eyes, those terrible, ageless eyes. They drew him down, as if sleep itself had hands. pulling him into a world that was not his own. He stood in a vast plain, dark and endless, where millions of people trudged in circles, men, women, children, all moving in lines, each carrying burdens they did not question. Overhead, faceless figures watched from towers of glass and iron, counting, measuring, taking. The people below plodded on, fed just enough to keep walking, just enough to keep giving. Edward saw himself among them. Years of routine, wages bled by unseen hands, his time shaved away like meat from a carcass. They were all cattle, not for slaughter of flesh, but of spirit, born to be fattened, harvested, consumed. Some were drained by endless taxes, others by debts, others by the weight of their own obedience. Different methods, same end. Every day their fire was stolen. Every day they were fattened for a furnace none of them could see, and yet they walked willingly, heads down, never asking why. Edward tried to shout, "Stop, look around you," but no sound left his lips. He felt the hand of the man from the auction on his shoulder and heard his whisper, "This is the world as it is. You thought you lived in freedom. You lived in a pen." The eyes blazed again, and the vision dissolved. The awakening. Edward jerked upright in the darkness, his chest heaving. The red glow of the clock read 3:07 a.m. Margaret slept beside him, undisturbed. The house was silent, but Edward's mind screamed. He turned on the lamp, the dream still clinging to him, and saw the card on his nightstand, the card the man had given him. He picked it up, stared at it. His hands trembled. He rose, dressed quickly in the half-light, each motion filled with an inevitability he couldn't explain. He slipped the card into his coat pocket. Then he opened the door, stepped out into the cold night, and pulled it shut behind him. The sound of it echoed like finality. Edward Hale was going to seek the man. Chapter 6. The drawing room. The door groaned open beneath Edward's fist. He peered into the darkness. No one stood there. No servant, no host. Only a draught of cold air and the faint glow of firelight deeper inside. Heart pounding, Edward stepped across the threshold. The house was vast, lined with portraits, whose eyes seemed to follow him down the corridor. He walked cautiously until he reached a grand drawing room. A fire roared in a stone hearth. In an armchair before it sat the man, hat, scarf, cloak, glasses, covered even here in the safety of his own dwelling. "Come in, Edward," the man said, his voice smooth as smoke. "I expected you a little sooner." Edward hesitated, then stepped forward. The man gestured to the chair opposite. "Sit." Edward obeyed. The conversation. The man leaned forward slightly, hands steepled. "Tell me, Edward, what sort of man are you?" Edward swallowed. "I don't know what you mean." "There are men who consume," the man said, voice low and deliberate. "They take, they drain, they use the work of others as fuel for their own emptiness. And there are men who create, who build, who give shape to the world. You've lived long enough among the first. You've worked for them, paid them, carried their burdens. Tell me, did you enjoy it? Did you enjoy living as their cattle?" Edward shook his head. "No, I hated it. Every day I hated it." The man's voice sharpened. "Would you wish others to live as you did? Bent, broken, waiting for a retirement that never comes?" "No," Edward said quickly. "I wouldn't wish that on anyone." The man tilted his head. "Then what? Would you let them live in the same prison of obedience you endured, or would you rather see the prison torn down?" Edward's breath caught. He felt something raw surge in him, something almost violent. "I'd rather see it die," he said, his voice trembling. "I'd rather burn it than watch it go on." The man leaned back slowly, as if savoring the words. "Then why don't you?" Edward froze. The man's voice dropped to a whisper. Because, Edward Hale, that is exactly what you've become. You hated the world, but you never lifted a hand against it. You let it use you. You let it feed on you. You let yourself rot in silence. Edward's face burned. The truth struck him harder than accusation. The man rose. Slowly, deliberately, he removed the wide-brimmed hat and laid it aside. He unwound the scarf, slipped off the dark glasses, and peeled back the gloves. Edward's stomach lurched. The face revealed was no human's. Flesh hung in tatters, pale and grey. The nose was gone, leaving only hollow ridges. The skin stretched thin across bone, pocked with cracks like old stone. Yet the eyes blazed, ancient, unyielding, alive with a terrible power. Edward tried to rise but couldn't. He was rooted to the chair, transfixed by horror. The man's voice came again, low and echoing, resonant with centuries. I am older than kingdoms, older than your history, older than the world you think you know. This is what time does, Edward. This is what it means never to die. The firelight danced across the ruin of his face, casting shadows like skulls upon the walls. And Edward knew then, with a certainty that chilled his soul, he was sitting before a vampire. Chapter 7. The Elder's offer. The figure before the fire straightened, his ruined face lit by the crackling glow, the ancient eyes fixed on Edward, and when he spoke, the very walls seemed to lean in to listen. My name, he said slowly, is Calef. I am elder, not the first, not the last, but among the oldest who yet walk in flesh. Edward's throat tightened. The word carried weight, not a title of choice, but of inevitability. Calef moved closer, his voice a low rumble. I have watched men for centuries, fatten themselves for the coal. It never changes. Age after age, empire after empire, man labours, saves, obeys. And for what? To be drained by kings, by taxes, by masters of coin, or, from my kind, as feed. It does not matter who holds the whip, Edward. The herd remains the herd. Edward swallowed. Is that why you brought me here? To feed on me? Calef gave a sound that was neither laugh nor sigh. No. What would be the point? You are already spent. You have been drained every day of your 59 years, bled by duty, by bills, by false masters. To feed on you now would be like drinking from a cask already emptied, a taste of something spoiled. You have given all you had. The words stung with truth. Edward's chest ached with them. Calef leaned forward, eyes burning brighter. You cling to 15 years, Edward. 15 years of dwindling strength, of watching the world slip from your hands. But I could change that. I could make those 15 years into 15 centuries. You would see the world as I see it. You would walk among men, knowing them for what they are, cattle, blind and docile. You would feed if you wished, or simply watch with eyes unclouded. Edward's voice cracked. Why? Why would you offer this to me? What am I to you? Calef studied him for a long moment, then spoke with measured weight. At the auction house, you desired what was beyond your reach. Yet, when the cane came to you wrongly, you gave it back. You acted with honesty in a world built on theft. That is rare, Edward. Most men, when handed power by mistake, clutch it and never let go. But you returned it, not because you feared me, but because you recognized what was not yours. That is why I chose you. Edward sat in silence, the fire painting his face with shadow. Calef's voice softened, though it still carried the resonance of ages. I do not want your answer tonight. I will know it when you are ready. Think on it, Edward Hale. You may remain in the world as it is, grinding, dwindling, forgotten. Or you may join my kind and see the world as it truly is, eyes open, At last. The fire flared, and for an instant the runes on the cane shimmered in Edward's mind. Calef's ruined face was calm, almost serene, as he whispered, "Choose, Edward, but know this, inaction is also a choice." Chapter 8. The Two Futures. Edward dreamt again. This time it was no vision of cattle or faceless crowds. It was him. The Elder. He stood tall, stronger than he had ever been, his frame cloaked in shadow, yet luminous with power. His face, unlined by age, bore the calm of one who could wait centuries between heartbeats. Around him, the world shifted like sand. Houses collapsed, reduced to dust. His own home crumbled into rubble before his eyes. He saw Margaret's grave, the stone weathered and cracked, grass rising to swallow it. He felt no grief, no tears, only the truth. Time was a tide, and he no longer drowned in it. He commanded it. He watched empires rise and fall, governments crumble, leaders march their herds to slaughter under the banners of tax and obedience. Musters shifted, names changed, but the pattern never altered, and he was outside it, driven by none, master of himself, eternal. The eyes he once feared were now his own, eyes that saw the world as it truly was. The mortal. The vision shifted. Now he was 72, his back bent, his breath shallow. He sat at the same kitchen table, the same stack of bills before him. Margaret, older too, murmured the same familiar words. "When the mortgage clears, Edward, we'll be comfortable." His hand shook as he pressed numbers into the calculator, trying to balance what little remained of a life spent working, paying, obeying. He looked up, and the walls seemed to close in. Time was almost gone. He had lived and died in a prison made of paper and debt. The years had taken everything and given nothing in return. The inevitable loomed, and this time there was no fire in his chest, only resignation. Edward jolted awake, gasping. The clock read 5:02. Sweat clung to his skin. His heart pounded like a drumbeat of decision. He turned to Margaret, still asleep beside him. Lines of fatigue etched deep into her face. He shook her gently.
Wake up!
"Margaret," he whispered, then louder. "Margaret, wake up."
What is it?
She stirred, blinking. "What is it? What's wrong?" "This ends now," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. She frowned in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Edward's eyes burned with a clarity she could not understand. He saw in her the same chains, the same conditioning, trapped, locked, designed from birth to live and die in the pen. She reached for his hand. "Edward, you're not making sense." He shook his head, gripped her tighter. "No longer." Margaret's eyes widened, searching his face, but she could not read the storm inside him. Edward knew the choice was made. Chapter 8. The Third Path. The old house stood quiet on its street, the front garden overgrown, the windows bare. Out front, a red and white sign read, "Sold." A plane thundered skyward, lifting from the grey English tarmac and vanishing into the blue. Waves shimmered in the heat of late afternoon. The air was heavy with salt and sun. A small beachside home stood behind them, simple and whitewashed, the kind built not for grandeur, but for living. Edward Hale, older now, his hair silvered, his skin lined by years of warmth rather than work, ran into the surf with the reckless joy of a boy. He dove beneath the water, then rose laughing aloud, the sea streaming down his face. "Come in, Margaret," he shouted.
Come on in.
His voice clear, his chest strong. "It's glorious." Margaret stood on the sand, older too, her dress fluttering in the breeze. She laughed at him, shook her head, then kicked off her sandals and rushed forward. The two of them splashed together, laughing, their joy echoing across the shore. No bills, no mortgage, No endless grind. Only time. Time finally live. Edward had chosen. Not 15 years dwindling. Not 15 centuries of decay. But life. Life beyond the pen. Beyond the false masters. Beyond the cold.
25,000 for the urn.
Far
I hear
away,
30?
in the dim hush of the auction house, the fire crackled once more. Calef sat where he always had, wrapped in cloak and scarf, the wide brim hat casting shadow over his ruined face. Another auction, another lot. Another man in the crowd raised a hand to bid. Calef turned, his ageless eyes locking onto the stranger. Slowly, with emotion older than memory, he tipped his hat, and the circle began again, the end.